We're delighted to have so many people join us today for In From the Margins. This is a webinar that is advancing a community development approach to achieving equality, social inclusion, participation and human rights for disabled people in Ireland. Good morning, everybody. My name is Damien Walsh. I work with Independent Living Movement Ireland, that's ILMI. We are a national cross-impairment disabled persons organisation, and we're delighted to jointly launch this webinar with our comrades in Community Work Ireland. We're delighted to have so many people join us today for In From the Margins. This is a webinar that is advancing a community development approach to achieving equality, social inclusion, participation and human rights for disabled people in Ireland. What I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly run through the agenda for this morning and also some ground rules. We're going to ask non-speakers to remain on mute for the process of today. And we're going to ask people to not use the chat function. We've actually disengaged the chat function because for people who have visual impairments and use screen readers, the chat function can be very frustrating when they're trying to listen into the presentations. We're delighted to have Elisabetta and Orla to provide ISL interpretation. And any of the presentations that use PowerPoint today, the presenters will speak through those and we can make the slides available after today. So the purpose of today is to begin a conversation around building community development approaches for collective autonomous spaces for disabled people to achieve equality inclusion in Ireland. And the reason we partner with Community Work Ireland, obviously, is their expertise is for community development practitioners who are already engaged in supporting collective spaces across a number of different grounds, whether it's on gender, sexuality, ethnicity, or on anti-poverty strategies. ILMI, as a disabled persons organisation, operates from the same principles of community development in terms of empowerment, participation, collective action, social justice. And we're really keen that the work that we do can be amplified through working with other community development organisations. What we partly wanted to begin today was by exploring why there have been an absence of those spaces in bringing disabled people together collectively in authentic autonomous spaces, and to draw parallels with other approaches in the past that have had organisations speak on behalf of communities without their active participation. So for the purpose of the morning, we have Peter Kearns, my colleague who coordinates our cross-border ONSIDE project, will give a bit of historical background to the lack of collective spaces for disabled people led by disabled people. And then we'd be delighted to be joined by Director of the Pavee Roma Centre, Martin Collins, who will talk about the absence of community development spaces with travellers and the impact of community development approaches to create autonomous local and national spaces for travellers. I'll then be joined by my colleague, one of our community development workers for the Department of Rural and Community Development Project, Paula Soraghan. Paula will talk about the role of disabled persons organisations, and we're delighted that Paula's role and our colleague Nicola is directly funded under the new CDP project, working directly with disabled people in the south of the country. At that point, we'll take a short break. Then we'll be joined by Rachel Doyle, who will briefly give us an introduction to the principles and practices of community development work. And then we'll be joined by Teresa Butler, who is a community development worker with Leitrim Development Company, who will talk about some of the practical applications of supporting the development of local disabled persons organisations. At that point, roughly at 12:35, we will have a Q&A session and a panel discussion. So we will allow through the chat function at that point for people to ask specific questions, either to Peter, to Martin, to Paula, Rachel or Teresa, or general questions, and I'll moderate that. Just to say, this session is being recorded so that we have it available on our YouTube channel by next week. So if people don't want their chat contributions to be recorded, please notify us around that. So thanks very much for everyone's participation. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Peter Kearns, who is going to talk through some of the historical context for why we're having today's discussion. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Dennis. Good morning, everybody. Just to quickly introduce my colleague, Clive Larry, who's in the background. And Clive is going to share my slides over my pretty face. So the slides are far more important than my pretty face. So Clive's going to set that up. I said to all and anytime my clock action then the CP is unclear to stop me and ask for clarification. So jump in anytime, all that, no problem. So in terms of this gig today, it's really like drawing a line in the sand for community development workers in Northern and getting to really recognise and identify and contemplate where, as Damien said, why has community development not really attracted or appreciated the presence of disabled people in the community development sector. So I give some historical background to it, but I also want to look at the look at where how community development is not enough on its own. That work with disabled people, that the community development practitioners will also have to have strong disability equality aspects and backgrounds to the work as well. So I'd like to start with a confession, or maybe just forget the religious element and just go for straightforward for a statement. My presentation is directly aimed at non-disabled community development practitioners. So it's not really concerned about non-disabled people who mostly work in the disability sector. Some of which might like to see themselves as community development workers, maybe in their personal terms, yeah, but well, I'm talking about actual genuine community development work in the mainstream, not in the disability sector. And we'll see as my talk goes on why community development cannot work in the disability sector. It can only work in the community and mainstream area. I talk about my work on that. Also, my colleague Paula will talk about, as I said, DPOs, disabled persons organisations. I'll do a quick into that in a second, but I'll let Paula go into detail about what a DPO actually is. So I'm starting here with a photograph from a colleague of ours, David Levy, who's a first generation Irish disabled activist in the UK. I definitely think there's a paper on first generation Irish disabled activists in Britain. There's quite a lot of them. So it'd be interesting to see why so many first and second generation Irish disabled people in Britain are so active in the movement. So but that's another day's work. I chose this photograph, which is it's a disability art photograph by David Hughes, who's now director of the Disability Arts Museum in London, which is fantastic. But David's work came over in the 90s to launch Light Disability Action, a film production course based in the Community Development Centre in Dublin, in Pavee, Dublin, the Clear Centre, where we delivered a film course based on community development principles with disabled people. So the image is black and white. It's a very old wheelchair. It's a wheelchair from the 1970s. It's just a wheelchair and a carcass of a dead goat in the wheelchair. So that's the image. So this this is, I'm going to explain it. This is a very magical model in English, and David is exploring what does this English communicate. And for community development workers, I'd like you to recognize that why is a DPO using images like this to communicate with community development workers? So the image is about I do most of my workshops in community centres, county resource centres. I don't do very many workshops in the disability sector. I talked about it. So today people see this image, and they talk about people like carcass. We don't know whether the carcass is male or female. We don't know whether it's black or white or Christian or Muslim or Jewish or atheist. So the idea is that the same people would say they've always felt like being treated like a lump of meat. So it's very much today, very much the community development sector recognizes that how do they attract disabled people into community development mainstream centres and give them the confidence to see themselves beyond just a piece of meat to be moved around. So Clive, can you move to the next slide, please? My colleague Clive is just moving to the next slide. So the next slide is also aimed at community development workers in terms of ask yourself, when you think of disabled people, what do you actually think? So we had this terrible idea about seeing, recognizing, again, it's a woman disabled person, it's a woman, we think, could be a man, could be transgender, we don't know, done on their own. And it's the idea that the danger is that community development workers would fall into the trap of seeing disabled people as inspirational, as I call it, inspiration. So if community development workers are going to work with disabled people, who are they actually working with and why? So below that is a fantastic cartoon by a colleague in Crippen. He's a disabled cartoonist. He's brilliant. He's been working for the past over 30 years with the disability movement. And he has a wonderful cartoon of disabled people being handed the labels by a care industry. So there's a label and go on and leave it like a label. So the danger is that for community development workers, they recognise that disabled people are not inspiration. They're not there to as a device, as a means of exploring the other. And also, disabled people are not identified with the labels which is handed to us by the disability sector. So community development has a role in challenging that idea of the label. So as myself, as a dramatist, when the plays, non-disabled actors always come to me and say, and the actor the impairment label. Wheelchair user, blind chair. And I say, what about the character? And they say, well, the impairment label for the director and the writer overshadows anything to do with the character. So the disabled actor is always, the non-disabled actor is always encouraged to portray the impairment, not the person. So again, I think a lot of community development workers to recognise that that's showing you brand new disability centre down the road compared to the usual community development centre that's just hanging on. It doesn't mean that disabled people actually have more resources. I mean, the disability sector has resources, not disabled people. So disabled people should be, the idea is to get those disabled people out of that attractive, brand new, shiny disability centre down to your decrepit or fallen apart community centre and make sure they're involved in that. So Clive, can you to the next thing? So in terms of community development workers, and in terms of the disability qualities perspective I talked about at the start, is that the community development workers is to recognise that that the learning they need to look at is around disability quality is to recognise the model, the medical model and the social model. Medical model is also called the characterised model, or the individual model, or the biopsychosocial model. So the idea is that the problem with the disabled person, they have to change, they have to integrate, they have to make themselves better. So an example of that was a few years ago with DESA, we organised a youth group in Hertford, and we had one disabled woman who was parachuted to the youth group. And I got the whole to integrate she had to change. So we did work with the youth group, and we did inclusive work, we did disability quality work, and we did also capacity building of the disabled young people. So it became not about integration but inclusion. So the social model is an emancipatory model. And as community development workers, we're always interested in that idea of emancipatory model. But they recognise that disabled people are coming from a history of institutionalization. And maybe Clive can jump to the next slide. So here you have a Paula Soraghan in County Dublin, a picture from the corridor. So the idea is that the medical professional, the disability sector professional, is directing disabled people to these types of centres. They're not quite decrepit. So some of these centres are quite modern, but don't be fooled by the actual centre. They are still very much owned and worked by non-disabled professionals. So the idea I'm looking about as well is to move disabled people away from those centres where they have no power, where they have a history of having no power. And if you go back to the Constitution in 37, which is very clear that written mostly by the Roman Catholic Church, is that the state should not provide a service, that any service should be provided by private organisation. So you think that even still now, at least 40% of disability services are provided by the Roman Catholic Church. So they are private neoliberal organisations getting 2.4 last year, 2.4 billion of the state to look after and basically control disabled people. Really. So as community development workers, we recognise that they are not emancipatory spaces. So we need to look at how do you move people, disabled people, out of these spaces into mainstream community centres. So Clive, can you move to the next slide? My colleague Paula is going to later talk about DPOs. Well, I'll quickly look at what DPO is. So it's run by disabled people. It's a very disability quality approach, a social model approach. It realises the UNCRPD, the convention, we could talk about in a second, and they are collective status. And they should be the go-to states platform for community development workers working with and for disabled. So you just quickly move on to the next slide. Yeah. So in terms of disability quality perspective, you'll see from that any community development worker will reckon, and Rachel will be looking at this later as well, in terms of the principles of community development. Any community development worker will recognise a lot of these disability quality approaches as being related to the principles of community development. So the idea of DPOs, which Paul will talk about, being collective action, empowerment as well. There's knowledge and the capacity to use it. So within the community sector, and DPO platforms is the empowerment of the knowledge and the ability and the capacity to use it. Something that can't happen in the disability sector because they are private organizations and who are 2.4 billion business. In terms of value and cost, you think the disability sector only the value of the term disability and disabled people only the cost or disabled world. So empowerment is having that knowledge, but also being able to use that knowledge as well. So social justice as well, in terms of community work, equality and equity, and then really effective participation as well. So as community workers, we recognise those principles informing disability equality. Myself, I did my postgraduate in my youth back in '92 on community development and early education, and since then I've been trying to make those community development principles become part of disability equality practice. So, can you move on to the next slide? So in terms of the community development, to recognise that we had a great tool or the aspirational guide of the UN Convention for Disabled People. Something I worked on 20 years ago in New York, which is a forum of people with disabilities. And the reason I'm identifying it here is to look at as community workers. Why we should community workers should use this brilliant, fantastic convention to direct their work from a disability equality social model perspective. So it clarifies the rights of disabled people, sets their responsibilities, and also contact with DPOs. It clarifies the use of the term disability and disability community development and disability equality perspective is the disabling barrier. It is not the impairment itself. And approach monitoring and evaluation and discourse and dialogue with genuine DPOs. So Claire, you move on to the next one. So for us as community development workers, we recognise that the UNCRPD should be embraced by community workers. But it's also inclusion, participation, non-discrimination, different dignity, equality, and equity. So for community development workers, this is given to us on the silver plate. It's fantastic to have for a so-called marginalised group for community workers to have this or 50 articles of the UNCRPD giving direction how we can work with and for and organise disabled people. So you move on to the next slide, Clive. So and especially in terms of UNCRPD Article 29B, the recognition of in terms of community development, non-government organisations, and the DPO needs or requirements for community workers to realise the forming journey of organisations with disabled people. So Claire, just move on to the next one. And then this is why disability equality community development is at home to UNCRPD. So it's about transformation. It's about social policy change as well. So we can send it, these slides will be sent out to all participants after the workshop. So don't worry about it. I'm just speeding up to make sure I get finished before my time. So I just make that next one. So in terms of disabled people, the idea of piss on pity, cripple the system. It's the idea of community development workers recognise that you don't fall into ableism. They don't fall over disabled people are looked after by the shiny disability centres and the roads. No, community workers need to recognise that they themselves conform to this idea of ableism, that disabled are looked after by the disability sector. So the idea of that disability is not a medical issue, it's a social, anthropological, and disability quality studies issue, which I feel that community development training and education need to realise. So we move on to next. And then just to finish off, why I feel disability equality for community development practice is important is that it provides DPOs the space in community centres to engage and populate behaviour. I'll give you a quick example. I worked a few years of one-to-ones with disabled people in Leitrim, and I asked them one-to-one in a disability centre, do you want to have your own place? And they all said, no, I'm quite happy at home, I'm in the residential home. I said, okay. Then with the Leitrim development company, Teresa Butler, we'll be talking about that relationship later. With the Leitrim development company brought into the community centre, we work with maps, and we do a budget on how to budget for a date. And we broke into groups, and we budget for clothes, restaurant, taxi. And I said at the end, okay, your date goes great. These are 28 young disabled people. Your date is great. Where do you go afterwards? Do you go home to Namibia to go home to a residential centre? And I asked the same question, who wants to get their own place? And all the hands went up. So, and it's great out of that, a couple of years ago, and out of that in Leitrim, the building of 6 houses have been built in one of the villages. So it's that idea that in the disability sector, the question, I could not really explore the question, but in the collective space of the community development space with Leitrim development company, I was able to work with MABs and the development company to ask the same question, and in the collective space, the same people were able to give a very different confidence. So I just move on to the last slide, and that was a quick 2 minutes over time. Apologies, Damien. And there's my email there, and I hope that was of some effect. So my role was to get the community development workers, mostly non-disabled workers, to recognise the role of disability equality and recognise that community development can only really happen outside the disability sector. So thanks very much, everybody. Hand you back to Amy.
Many thanks, Peter. I know you're trying to achieve the impossible to provide a historical context and explain why the community development approach, working directly with disabled people from an equality and rights perspective, is how we'll achieve change through disabled persons organisations. So I'm just going to ask Martin Collins now to provide us with some context of some parallels around community development approaches with Travers creating collective spaces for Traveller organisations. So Martin, thanks very much for joining us. That's perfect, Martin.
Sorry about that. Okay, yeah, thanks, Damien, and for the invitation to be part of this really important discussion. I think you might have said at the top of the hour that I'm the director of Pavee Point. I'm not quite sure if you did or not, but just to clarify, I'm the co-director of Pavee Point. I'm not sure if you did, but anyway. So just to give you some of the historical context in terms of the different approaches to the work with Travers, we have to cast our mind back, I think, to 1963 with that very pivotal report called the Commission on Itinerancy. Some people here might be familiar with that report, but basically it set out to solve the so-called itinerant problem through policies of assimilation, integration, and it spoke about, it used terminology, for example, the final solution and so forth. So a very racist document, which did set a framework for action and understanding in terms of approaches to the work with Travers. What was also quite interesting about this commission, it comprised of about 25 individuals, civil servants, politicians, and members of the clergy. There was no Travers voice at that table. Now, we're all very familiar that there's a long history of exclusion and marginalisation of Travellers in a wider societal context. but there's also a long history of exclusion of travellers from decision-making processes where decisions get made, where policies get developed that have a relevance and an impact on our lives. And in fact, right up until 1989, actually, there was a special advisor to the government on traveller issues. And of course, that was a settled person. And of course, it was also a priest. So the clergy had a huge role in terms of interactions with travellers, and in fact, colluding with the state around policies of assimilation and civilising and normalising travellers in inverted commas. The first attempt really to put up any sort of a fight or a resistance to these racist approaches was Minker back in the early 80s. It was people like, Nan Joyce, who was the face of Minker, other people like Thomas McCann and Mick McCann, were very actively involved in highlighting traveller issues through direct action and protesting. And so it was a really important, if you like, first attempt to put up a resistance. My own personal involvement in terms of getting involved in the traveller struggle was in 1985, when previously known as Dublin Travellers Education and Development Group, when it was formally established in January of 85. That was my first involvement. And that was a very important moment in our struggle, because with the establishment of Dublin Travellers Education and Development Group, it did offer a very innovative and new analysis and approach to the work with travellers. For example, one of its founding principles was supporting and creating the conditions for travellers' self-determination. Travellers having a voice, having an influence at the table in terms of policy and policy implementation. And of course, this was very much informed about a community work approach, about empowerment, participation, creating leadership, collective action, dealing with causes rather than symptoms, affecting institutional and social change, campaigning for social justice and human rights. So that's what the community development approach offered to our community. So in terms of self-determination, one of the key principles our premise is that there can be no significant or sustainable change in the traveller situation unless travellers are involved in all stages of the process. So that's absolutely paramount. What was also unique in terms of the approach of Dublin Travellers Education and Development Group at the time is that we began to frame the issues very differently. So for example, it was, we were looking at traveller issues through a human rights lens, and also acknowledging that the experience of travellers was one of racism. So that whole analysis, there was a paradigm shift from one of charity, viewing travellers as a subculture of poverty or people who are destitute, and all you have to deal with is with the poverty. So that analysis was turned on its head. So now there was a new way of looking at traveller issues. And as I say, they were being framed in terms of human rights violations, and that racism was the core issue that needed to be addressed. It also acknowledged the need for anti-racist policies, anti-racist legislation, and anti-racist practices. So that was very much groundbreaking at the time. And then the third one was the recognition and support of our distinct cultural identity, and for travellers to be recognised as a minority ethnic group in Irish society. And of course, that came to pass on the 1st of March of 2017. And this whole thing around cultural rights and the right to one's identity and history and language is quite important, because people must understand there's been a long history, not just decades, but indeed centuries of, we being stripped of our cultural identity and our cultural integrity. And then as a result of that, you have what was called internalised oppression, internalised shame, where travellers end up hiding their identity. And so the recognition of traveller ethnicity does restore pride and confidence within the community, and that was really important as well. So those were the three key principles which informed the work of Dublin Travellers Education and Development Group, subsequently to become Pavee Point Travel and Roma Centre. And I remember some really very important moments back in the very first training programme in Mead Street in 1985. And I was very lucky to be one of 24 young travellers at the time, be part of that. That personal development leadership training programme was very much about consciousness raising. It was around politicising travellers, and it was around developing a critical awareness and critical reflection of society, how society is structured, whose interests get served by the class system, and so forth. And I do remember one moment in John O'Connor, Lord rest him, who was the director of Pavee Point back then. He was doing a training session with us around human rights and racism. And in the group of 24 travellers, it's most of us, there might be one or two who did understand the term discrimination. Most of us didn't. And John gave an example, those who experienced discrimination, put your hands up. And very few hands went up because we didn't understand the language. And when he explained it differently, how many of you have been refused service in the shop, then we all understood. And that was really a seminal moment, certainly in our development, both individually and collectively as a people, because here we were now acquiring a new language to describe a novel experience of oppression, persecution, human rights violations. I think only maybe 2 in the group had that sort of language. The other 22, of which I was one of them, never heard that language before. So that was really empowering to be acquiring this new language to describe an old and indeed an ongoing experience. And really what informed the work at the time was the pedagogy of the oppressed with Paula Soraghan, around liberation theology. That was very much core to the approach of the work at the time. And I remember actually, because this was a new analysis, it was very innovative. It did threaten the power structures. It did challenge those who were supposedly representing travellers' interest at the time, other voluntary organisations. And, that was a difficult time because I remember quite distinctly letters being sent into ANCO at the time, subsequently to become FOSS and now Solace, basically saying that we shouldn't be funded, and that we were all this stuff like we were linked to the IRA and, as if that were a bad thing. but all these sort of rumours were doing the rounds, letters going in, anonymous letters saying we shouldn't be funded, because people were genuinely threatened by this new approach around empowerment, around self-determination, travellers speaking up, travellers representing themselves. And this was their way of reacting to it. So in the last 30 years, community development and a community development approach and its inherent principles around human rights, around equality, around justice, around participation, leadership, having a voice, has served our community very, very, very well. And I've been very fortunate to be part of that journey for the last 35 years, where I have witnessed the emergence of some really fantastic traveller activists, leaders, and community development workers, both at local level and national level, doing Trojan work in representing the interest of our people. And we've got to the stage now where, the community development has served us so well, that we have a number of different autonomous spaces where we can meet and discuss and reflect and strategize. And some of those spaces are a shared space. In other words, travellers and settled people, working together in partnership. And that has served us very well. And I think it's important that we hold on to that. But equally, we have created a traveller-only space in the name of Mincare Widden. And I think that's really important as well. And I don't see them in any way contradictory. I think they're mutually beneficial, mutually complementary. So that's how far we have come on our journey as a people, as a movement, as a struggle for justice and equality, where we can have a number of spaces. We can have the shared space and we can have the traveller only space. And then finally, I leave you with this. I remember John, Lord rest him, back in the early days, because of this new approach, as I've said, others felt very uncomfortable with it. And John was effectively summoned to a meeting by another priest. And he challenged John on this approach to the work with travellers. John came back to the group and he informed us what took place at the meeting. And these words will stay in my head till the day I die. This priest who summoned John to the meeting, he said, why are you making them aware of their pain and their suffering? I'll leave you with that.
Many thanks, Martin. That was incredibly powerful, and I really appreciate your expertise and your knowledge on that journey of the community development approach from you from a personal perspective, but also collectively the impact it has had. And I hope people are drawing the parallels of where disabled people and DPOs are now is very much where Dublin Travellers Education Development Group were in the mid to late 80s, that we are creating those collective spaces for disabled people locally and nationally. We are looking at systemic barriers. We are talking about empowerment, participation, and we also are looking at how disabled people have been oppressed and denied their rights. And that's what fundamentally makes this approach different for disabled people up until now. But it is very much drawn on the struggles that other groups have gone through using collective community development approaches. And when Martin talked about that awareness raising, people having the language of equality and rights, have been at the table, haven't been denied that opportunity. That's what we're looking to build over the course of the work of ILMI through those community development approaches. And that's why we're reaching out to community development workers to see the importance of that approach. I really appreciate Martin for taking the time to do that. I'm now going to ask my colleague, Paula Soraghan, to give us an input on the role of Disabled Persons Organisation. Thanks very much, Paula.
Thank you, Damien, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak at this event. It's a great privilege, and thank you so much to Peter and Martin for your wonderful speeches and presentations. They're very powerful, and just, I suppose, before I get into my presentation, my name is Paula Soraghan. I am a very proud and confident disabled woman. I first joined ILMI as a member back in 2019-2020, and I'm now very proud to say that I am working for ILMI as a community development worker on the VOICE project, the virtual online inclusive communities for empowerment project, with my colleague Nicola Meikle. So just before I get into my presentation, I want to give a bit of background about my own personal experience in actually getting involved with the DPO. So I suppose just to begin with my own personal journey, and as a disabled person, I didn't always identify as a proud, confident disabled woman. I grew up in the medical model, as Peter referred to in his presentation earlier. I have the impairment label cerebral palsy, so I kind of felt internally, and Martin mentioned it, the internalized depression, that my cerebral palsy was my disability. So I always felt like something was the matter or something was wrong. And I just didn't feel like I really fit in anywhere. But I was really good at masking these things and kind of putting on a brave face and passing that these things didn't bother me. So I always kind of really longed to belong in community and kind of meet like-minded people and to try and make a bit of a change. But I didn't really know where to begin. So in 2019, I was kind of feeling really lost. I wasn't really in the best place mentally in terms of my emotional well-being. So I decided I needed to make a change because I was stuck in a rut. So I reached out to a friend who mentioned ILMI, and they mentioned that they had their AGM on in the Gibson Hotel on the 28th of September. So I went to the AGM, and that day changed my life forever because I learned about the social model, I learned about DPOs and what a DPO was, and I was welcomed with open arms into this community of like-minded people. And that really empowered me and really set me on my journey as an activist. And thankfully, because that was such a turning point, I haven't looked back since. And I first got involved, as I say, in ILMI as a member. And that really came at a brilliant time because that was September 2019. And as we know, fast forward 6 months, the country was in lockdown due to COVID. So it was wonderful to be involved, even though we were in lockdown, with ILMI and in their online spaces, and to really feel that sense of community and sense of belonging, and that I was part of a collective. I'm really trying to make a difference. And I'm now studying my master's as well in disability equality studies, and I work for ILMI. So I'll just get into the presentation now. So let me just here. So what is a disabled persons organisation or a DPO? So as Peter said earlier, DPOs, unlike disability service providers, they're led by and for disabled people. and DPOs work on a cross-impairment basis with disabled adults. And DPOs are about bringing disabled people collectively together to bring about more inclusive and equal society. And they're really spaces for disabled people informed through an equality, human rights and social model of disability lens. And as Peter said earlier, DPOs should be the go-to body that statutory and non-statutory organisations engage with as the voice of the lived experiences of disabled people. And because that's so important, and as Martin said earlier, really it's the lived experience, because we are the experts on our own lives, and not, as Martin said earlier, non-traveller people or settled people. And in our instance, it's not non-disabled professionals and the disability service industry. So what would ILMI want a local DPO to do? So local DPOs will work within the ILMI defined value system, cross-impairment, they're non-hierarchical, the recognition of diversity, and that applies to socio-economic status, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity, towards working collectively on a shared social model analysis to become local DPO representatives in relation to housing, social inclusion, employment, education, and so forth, and to really work collectively on local issues to inform effective social inclusion. So really what that means is that locally it's very important, because then that passes on to nationally and vice versa. And it's really about addressing the systemic issues and barriers that disabled people face. And it's really about engaging with disabled people locally to actually make them aware of the issues that they're facing, and that they actually can have, and they do deserve, as a basic human right, choice and control over all aspects of their lives. Because so many people still, disabled people are still engaged with disability service providers, and they feel that they don't have a choice, and they feel that, non-disabled professionals, that they know best. And that's very problematic, because so many disabled people then, as a result, they're caught in this constant cycle of institutionalization, which unfortunately for a lot of disabled people means that that's from birth right up until death, unfortunately. So we're really trying to break that cycle and address those issues head on as a collective. And really to engage with ILMI policy discussions, to connect the local to the national and vice versa. And as Peter said earlier, that's really about engaging with the UNCRPD and actually making that a reality. So why is ILMI developing and providing disability equality support to local DPOs? So local DPOs have actually been mandated at ILMI AGM to be an essential aspect of our 2019 to 2022 strategic plan. And as Peter said earlier, the UNCRPD clearly states that the ideal structure for disability equality proofing local and national policies is by engaging with grassroots DPO collectives. So it's not about, a top-down approach. It's actually about engaging on a grassroots level with the very people whose lives are most impacted by these decisions and by these oppressive structures. And ILMI will support local DPOs to capacity build with community development, disability equality, and lived experience approaches. And ILMI's role is to make the UNCRPD relevant to local DPOs. And really that's about, again, going back to what I said earlier, about all aspects of society that impact disabled people's lives, whether that's the lack of transport, employment issues, housing, personal assistance services. It's whatever affects the disabled person, to make sure that they have all the information that they need, and that they're in the room when policy decisions are being made, that they can actually help to make a change. And it's really about building up really focusing on disabled activism as well with disabled people in local DPOs, because that really is so important. So just to move on to two very important projects that ILMI are currently working on. We have many different projects, but I thought I'd highlight two for the purposes of this presentation. So the first one is ONSIDE, so the Outreach and Navigation for Social Inclusion and Digital Engagement project. And that's a really dynamic and exciting creative venture that's coordinated by ILMI in the Republic of Ireland and by our partners in Northern Ireland, Disability Action Northern Ireland, Supporting Communities, and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. And it really connects disabled people living in border counties using IT equipment as a historic free tablet, which is a great initiative to get people involved, because many disabled people, they may not have access to that kind of equipment. So it's a great incentive that if somebody signs up for the project, that they get their IT training, which is so important. And that really leads them on a journey of self-discovery and empowerment, whether, they want to engage fully with their communities, pursue employment, pursue education, pursue love, whatever it is. That's kind of really been very effective in the ONSIDE project with the great work that they do. And it's really introducing the disabled people, bringing them out of the medical model and really introducing them to the social model, and letting them know that, there is so much choice and control that we all deserve over our own lives. And that's really the autonomous approach that ILMI has in all of its projects, including ONSIDE. And really it's person-centred as well. So the ONSIDE workers aren't saying to the disabled people that participate, we're doing X, Y, and Z. It's what they want to do, in terms of their developing their personal action plans, and letting them know, if you want to do this, here's how we're going to signpost to help you achieve your goals and dreams, and that helping you realise your full potential. And as I say, it's the autonomous approach that the disabled person decides what goals they want to achieve and how local DPOs can support that. And really, it's so important that the ongoing funding for DPOs is actually put in place, because funding for a project is only up to a certain amount of time. So it's imperative that that funding continues so that the work of the local DPOs can continue, so that from an activist point of view and community development point of view, that it doesn't stall, that it's actually ongoing, which is very important for ONSIDE. And then moving on to the VOICE project, the Virtual Online Inclusive Communities for Empowerment project. That's the project, as I said earlier, that myself and my colleague Nicola have started working on in January. And it's an exciting new project funded by the Department of Rural and Community Development. And it's focused on connecting with disabled people in Kilkenny, Carlow, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Kerry and Tipperary. I work with disabled people in the first 4 counties and Nicola in the latter 3. And it uses Zoom as a means of digital outreach and networking to really combat social exclusion. And the reason why that was chosen was because Zoom was extremely effective when COVID first started and we were in lockdown, as I said earlier, about connecting disabled people through Zoom in those online collective spaces, so that disabled people weren't actually isolated. And it broke down that barrier of, if you needed to get out and go, say, to Dublin, that a lot of disabled people might have barriers when it comes to transport or a personal assistance service. They might not have that available. Whereas at least with Zoom, the click of a button and you're in a collective space with disabled people who are like-minded and who are activists as well. And again, like ONSIDE, it's the autonomous approach. So the disabled people will develop personal action plans over the course of the VOICE project to focus on goals that they have. So it's really about engaging with disabled people, 1 county at a time, and actually letting them know who ILMI are and what the VOICE project is and why it's so important and why they need to get involved. And it's about building up the ILMI membership in those 7 counties and engaging with disabled people and letting them know that we will work with them to break down any issues that they're having in their local communities, whether that's in relation to transport, employment, education, and so on. And again, local activism. So the DPOs will be established in each county to work on local barriers, like I said earlier, transport, housing, employment, and personal assistance. And disabled people will be included in local structures like their housing and disability steering groups. And just to finish, I suppose, it really highlights the importance of DPOs and why we need to engage with DPOs from a community development point of view and why continuous funding needs to be provided. So thank you very much for listening today. Really appreciate it.
Many thanks, Paula. Welcome back everyone to Into the Margins, a joint webinar between Independent Living Movement Ireland and Community Work Ireland. So in the first half of the webinar, we had inputs from Peter Kearns, Martin Collins and Paula Soraghan talking about the need for community development approaches for collective autonomous spaces, whether it's for travellers or for disabled people. So it's entirely appropriate that we now have an input from Rachel Doyle, who's the Joint National Co-ordinator of Community Work Ireland, to talk through the principles and practices of community development as a process. Many thanks, Rachel.
Thanks a million, Damien, and thanks to ILMI for inviting us to partner with you on this really important event today, which we see, I suppose, as the start of a process. It's not just a one-off event, it's something that we want to continue to work together on in terms of moving forward and promoting community work as an approach and a means to addressing the barriers and the challenges faced by disabled people in Ireland. So we very much see this as part of a process, and also feeds into, I suppose, the work that we're doing with ILMI in relation to the VOICE project, that community development project that ILMI are undertaking and that Paula described earlier. And we do have a role as Community Work Ireland in supporting that. So we just look forward to, I suppose, working together, exploring the kind of processes that Martin referred to earlier in terms of travellers. How can we start to bring those processes into work with disabled people through the establishment and maintenance and support of disabled people's organisations themselves. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about community work and what it is. I think Paula, Peter, Martin have already covered actually a good bit of what I'm going to be saying. So I'll be talking about it a little bit more in the wider context than just focusing on disabled people. So I'm going to just share my screen with you now. Hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so yeah, so I'll just start maybe by saying a little bit about Community Work Ireland and who we are as an organisation. We were set up in 1981, at the time called the Community Workers Cooperative, and we changed our name a couple of years ago. Although it's the same organisation, same values, same beliefs, some of the same people still involved in it. And we are a network of about 800 members who are community workers working throughout Ireland. And our job really is to promote and support community work or community development. We use those terms interchangeably as a means of addressing poverty, social exclusion, inequality, promoting, protecting and advancing human rights, and ultimately achieving social change to contribute to the creation of a just, sustainable and equal society. So that's our long, I suppose that's our long mission. And just to say, I suppose I wanted to just start off by kind of reiterating and reaffirming what was said by the other speakers earlier, that community work is about collective organising for positive social change, where the voices of those most excluded are at the centre. So that in a nutshell is what community work is. It's not about charity. It's not a charity model. It's not a patronising model of work. It's an empowering, collective campaigning model of work, where those who are most affected by the issues that they're working on are at the centre of that and have a say in what's happening. So Community Work Ireland has always been, I suppose, concerned with the idea of participative democracy. So we say that central to community development is the principle of participation. And that is absolutely and fundamentally key. So we talk about that in the context of participative democracy, and in that way recognize that real meaningful participation of communities is an important aspect of democracy. We can't just leave it up to the politicians. So I have a cartoon there on this slide, and the left of the cartoon has a heading Representative Democracy, and there's a cartoon of a politician talking to people and saying, vote for me and I'll speak for you. And then on the other side of the cartoon is of the slide is another cartoon saying participative democracy. How about letting us speak for ourselves? So it's not about saying we don't need politicians. It's just saying politicians do not know everything and they need to be informed by the collective voices of communities experiencing the issues. So we, in our organisation, have always believed in and worked to promote the right of people and communities that are marginalised to have a say in decisions, policies and programmes that affect them. And that is not easy work. It's simply not, because there are those who believe that representative democracy, in fact, is the way, and that there isn't much space and shouldn't be too much space given to civil society and to community organisations. But I just took this quote from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN, and on the left I have a photo just of people campaigning and holding up a banner saying disability rights are human rights. But that quote from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights says that the right to participate in public affairs is a right that enables people to share ideas, form new ones, and join together with others to claim their rights. It is through the exercise of these public freedoms that we make informed decisions about our economic and social development. It's through these rights that we can take part in civic activity and build democratic societies. To restrict them undermines our collective progress. So here there's a recognition that for sustainable economic and social development to happen, people must be facilitated and supported to join together to claim their rights and to have a say, again, in the decisions that affect them. And I suppose this is where community development comes in for us. And how we define community development is that we say it is a task and it is a process. So it's not just a task on its own right. The task is informed by a process. And the task, well, what is that task? What are we trying to do? We're trying to make change, not just for one or two people, not just to get Mary on a course or to get John a job. It's not about that. It's about making collective change in policy and practice. That is and law, which is fundamentally what community work is about. So anything that we do, we need to keep an eye on. What is the change we're looking for here? What are we demanding and what are we calling for? And then the practice of that, the how we're doing it. How are we actually doing that? What is the process? So the process around that is about ensuring, again, that the people affected are included, that they get to participate in decisions, that their experiences inform the work, that they feel empowered and energized as a result of that involvement. So in community work, Martin described it earlier, we're making change, but we're doing it with people. So it's about them, their involvement, their inclusion, and their voice at the end of the day. And in that sense, we talk about community work as being a journey from the real to the ideal. And Peter spoke about this earlier, what the situation is now and what we want to turn it into. What do we want to change? So community work is a process, as I've said, and it's a journey going from the current situation to where we want to be. So it might be, the real might be around, well, we're all very individualistic. We're more concerned for ourselves, for me and my family only. The journey of community work brings us to collective working and redistributing opportunities and demanding redistribution of resources for everyone. The real might be poverty, disableism, racism, sexism, homophobia. The community work journey brings us to equality, rights, and recognition and valuing of diversity. The real might be exclusion. The ideal is inclusion of and solidarity with others, including those not like us, and building social cohesion. The real, as we know, is power held only in the hands of the few. Our vision and the journey we want to go on is for collective empowerment, people enhancement and contributing skills and resources. And then the real is where policies are far removed from the lives and needs of communities, and community work brings us on a journey where we are deepening democracy, where we have better policy, where people are participating meaningfully in influencing decisions which affect them. So that journey and that process from the real to the ideal. And just thinking about power, I suppose community work also analyzes and thinks a lot about power. Who holds power and how do we shift it? And often our experience, I think, of power as civil society organizations, as community groups, as communities who experience poverty and exclusion, is that there is very little power actually at that level. We want to move to a situation where we move up the ladder. So on the left of this slide, I have a ladder going up a wall. The bottom of the ladder, we talk about therapy and manipulation. So people who have no power and who basically are being told what is best for them on the basis of the expert view. I think Peter touched on that earlier and Paula as well. We are manipulated and told what to do because leave it up to the experts. We don't have power. We want to shift that to moving up that ladder to not even at that level of placation, consultation and informing, degrees of tokenism. And I think we all suffer from consultation fatigue. We're consulted, we're asked our views, we're consulted, we're asked our views, but we're not really given any power to influence the decisions at that policy, legal and policy level. So we're stuck sometimes in that consultation mode and running around to meetings and being asked our views on things and then seeing no change at the end of the day. So we're trying to shift in community work from the manipulation and therapy and zero power through that tokenism and up to the top of the ladder, where we have, in this diagram, it says citizen control. I would say resident control, because citizen has its own implications in terms of people's legal rights, but people power, people control, where power is handed over and there is real and meaningful collaboration, partnership and engagement with communities at the top of the ladder. And that's where we're striving to get to. And I say striving and meaning, really mean that. Just on that point about community development as a journey again, and Martin talked about this earlier, that journey involves building the consciousness, capacity, and confidence of community members to become active and engaged players in solidarity and connection with each other. So Martin talked about that group of 20 odd travellers, 20 ex-travellers who had never heard about, didn't know what discrimination was. There's probably no travellers now who don't know what discrimination is in this country, you know, as a result of that journey that small group went on and that the community has gone on over the decades. The journey requires community workers, those of us in jobs, whether we're from the community or partnering with communities, it requires us to acknowledge diversity amongst the communities that we work with and to target those most excluded, including disabled people and others. Because it's very easy for us, as it is for everybody else, to say, yes, we're open to everybody joining. We're open to anyone joining our community group or our organisation or whatever it is. But we know that unless supports are put in place and communities and people in those communities are specifically asked, outreach, included, encouraged and asked to engage, that won't happen. And it requires us to provide those opportunities for training and education for change, education and community work as well, capacity building programs, networking, building solidarity with other communities seeking a more just and equal society, campaigning, protesting, lobbying, and demanding representation and places at the table. But that is all about a process. It is not just about turning up to an event. We can see here from looking at all this and from hearing the earlier presentations that this is a complicated process that people go through and requires commitment from community members, from community workers, from all of us to engage in this process and to I suppose have a vision for where we want to get to and a commitment to sticking it out and staying involved. So fundamentally, I suppose what community work believes is that the issues and challenges faced by groups who experience poverty, inequality, and social exclusion, I should say, including disabled people, are created by state policies, laws, and practices that serve to undermine their rights and to further exclude them. The problems aren't in the communities themselves. Therefore, they can't be fixed in the communities themselves. The problems have to be fixed in terms of the systemic change at state and government and policy level that needs to change. And that's where our focus needs to be. And so those values and principles of community work support that idea of the social model of disability. But in order for this to happen, in order for this journey, for us all to be able to go on this journey, we need things. There's things that we need. So we need strong, autonomous, independent community work to be supported and resourced. And I mean independent and autonomous in the sense of we need the funding, but we need to have an independent critical voice and be allowed to have that funding, to have that critical voice, and not have our funding held over us. If you criticize us, we'll withdraw your funding. That's not going to work. So we need that strong, autonomous community work. The Community Development Programme and the Voice Project being funded by the Department of Rural and Community Development, and that funding for ILMI to set up those disabled people's organisations is a start in that process. We also need acknowledgement and recognition of the knowledge, experience and expertise of disabled people and their representative groups, DPOs, based on the needs of communities and defined by those community groups themselves. Oftentimes we hear government departments talk about the need for capacity building in our sector, that we need to have our capacity built. And there's questions around that. Who's going to build our capacity? And also, what about capacity building on the part of the state? So the state needs to recognize that we actually have expertise and that our sector, disabled people's organizations, they're the ones who have the expertise, and that needs to be acknowledged. So community work, and I probably don't need to get into this in too much detail because Peter, Martin, Paula, everybody has referred to the values-led approach of community work, but that approach is actually written down in the All-Ireland Standards for Community Work, and it's acknowledged by government at this stage that community work is underpinned by core values. Because if we don't have a values-led approach, then community work is anything. It could be the far right organising and empowering themselves and mobilising and campaigning and building their capacity. So community work is very much a values-led approach. And the All-Ireland Standards for Community Work set that out quite clearly. They were published in 2016 by the All-Ireland Endorsement Body for Community Work, Education and Training, and supported by ourselves in Community Work Ireland. They're actually on our own website. If you want to download them, you can get them there. And they're the result of a nationwide consultation with stakeholders, with funders, with state agencies, but most importantly with communities and community workers to set out what do we mean by community work and how do we want it to be informed. So the standards themselves, they were supported by Pavee, so they're given a kind of a bit of a, I suppose, an official stamp of approval at that level, which is good. And they aim to provide a reference point and a guide for key stakeholders promoting and supporting community work. And those stakeholders are community development organisations, community workers, funders and policymakers. So it's like a guide for them in terms of if you're funding community work, this is what you need to be funding. So those values, I think Peter's already touched on them. Collectivity is the first one. So that's about building collective analysis and collective action and collective outcomes. Empowerment is absolutely key. And here we talk about the need to work together to become critical, creative and active participants, leading communities to be resilient, organised, included and influential. The third value of community work is social justice and sustainable development becoming more and more, I suppose, part of the discussion and the narrative around how our society and economy grows. Although often we should be thinking about degrowth, which I think people are talking about now in terms of sustainable development. But community work thinks about and considers and takes action on these issues by promoting policies and practices that are environmentally, economically and socially sustainable and that challenge injustice and value diversity. Just two more: human rights, equality and anti-discrimination. So it's about focusing on promoting human rights and equality, challenging discrimination, and also looking at that issue of women's rights and gender equality. Women are half of the population, and we sort of, in the standards, we talk about the importance of a focus on gender equality and that sort of intersectionality of oppressions. So if you are a disabled woman, your experience might be different to that of a disabled man, or if you're a disabled woman who is a traveller, your experience will be different to non-traveller disabled women. And I know Rosalie McDonough speaks a lot about that experience as well, but just kind of keeping in mind the different experiences that people have. None of us fit into a little box, and none of us are the same. And then the fifth one that we've talked a lot about is about participation, real meaningful participation and engagement, and an acknowledgement that policies and programs targeted at communities will not and cannot be effective without the meaningful participation of those communities in their design, implementation and monitoring. So I'm going to jump to this last one here, which is just a quote from Ban Ki-moon, who was the UN Secretary General. It's an old quote now, but I still think it's a good one. So he said, recognizing the important role of civil society at the local, national, regional and international levels, special emphasis should be given to measures to assist in the strengthening of a pluralistic civil society and to the real and effective participation of the people in decision-making processes. And as I've said, I think community work is an important way of ensuring that that can happen. Thank you.
I really appreciate that, and it's a crucial input to remind us of why we're here today, to talk about those principles of community development approaches, how they apply to any marginalized community who's experiencing systemic inequality. And specifically in this instance, we're talking about the systemic inequalities that disabled people face through the societal barriers that prohibit and prevent the active and full participation as disabled people as equals in society. So thanks very much for that, Rachel. And for our final speaker, I'm just going to ask Teresa Butler, who is a community development worker in Leitrim Development Company, to talk about some of the practical approaches that can be taken to support those collective autonomous spaces for disabled people. Thanks very much, Teresa.
And thanks very much, Damien, and thanks to ILMI and Community Worker Ireland for inviting me to this very important event. I suppose, being the last speaker, I'm going to have to work very hard to keep your attention, because at this stage, you know, you're probably thinking about lunch, so I'll try and make my presentation riveting. So first of all, I am talking to you, community development workers. That's my audience. And just to say a little bit about myself, just very briefly, I'm from North Dublin, Finglas West, a disadvantaged community in Dublin. I would have been very aware of class issues. I was involved in the women's movement in the 70s and also in the social welfare movement. So I would have very personal experience of discrimination and marginalisation, I suppose, in my own history. And in terms, and I was also one of the first community development workers to be put through the Maynooth process. So that's another thing I can say about myself. So to get your attention, so I think I'm visible to you. So I think one of the main things I would like to say is that disabled people at local level can be invisible. They and I think for community development workers, our job is to make disabled people visible at local level. And one of the ways we can do that is through the development of DPOs. Just to say to you as well that that within organisations, to say we need to make a professional commitment to work with disabled people, because every community development worker knows that when you go into your job on any day of the week, you can be pulled 20 different ways. So you need to say to yourself, I am going to work with disabled people, because I work in Leitrim Development Company, and I work under the SICAP program. Within the SICAP program, there are many groups vying for attention. Disabled people are one of them. And in fact, disabled people are one of the key groups under the SICAP program. So it is important that as development workers, we put a focus on disabled people within our prospective organisations. And I think my experience is that even within my organisation, which is committed to working with disabled people, I need to advocate that work within my own organisation to workers, to other workers, because obviously all workers within your organisation should be working with and advocating for disabled people. That's the first thing I would say, is to make a professional commitment yourself to working with disabled people. And then the second thing is that in terms of my work with disabled people in Leitrim Development Company, I would have initially worked in 2015 to set up and establish the Leitrim Disability Equality Network. And that was an attempt to highlight the voices of disabled people at local level. And in that structure, I suppose I would have worked with DESA, that disability organisation, and we would have also had within that non-disabled people. And while it was useful, because obviously we were trying to promote disabled people within the sector, it wasn't a perfect structure, because it wasn't the voices of disabled people. And very often when you have non-disabled people in a room, the voices of disabled people are not as vocal as they should be. So the current structure I'm working with, and it's with through ILMI, Independent Living Movement, is the Leitrim Disabled Persons Organisation. So we've already heard what a DPO is, but what are the practicalities of establishing a DPO? And I would say that the main issue under the programme in Leitrim Development Company, which is SICAP, is that there needs to be a dedicated resource. My job is very broad. I can work one day with women, one day with refugees, different people. So I think it's very important that there should be a dedicated resource within organisations to work with disabled people. So in our organisation, we have dedicated resources to work with travellers. So Martin would have talked about the traveller movement and the journey that they've gone on. And to be fair to them, they've done a great job, because within our organisation and within many development organisations, there is dedicated resources to work with travellers specifically. So in my organisation, there's a whole team of people that work with travellers. And they would have funding from SICAP, but also from the HSC and from different projects. In my organisation, there's a dedicated person who works with older people, and that person does nothing else. So I think that the only real way to promote and to establish DPOs at local level, the only practical way, is to have a dedicated resource. Where that comes from, how that's funded, is another issue. And I think it should sit within development organisations, because development organisations have the relationships with the mainstream. They have the relationships with the agencies, with the policymakers. That's been well established, because development companies have been here really for a long time in Ireland, and they are known and respected at local level to promote the rights of disadvantaged groups. So I think that that's where it should sit. And up to now, I suppose, in Leitrim Development Company, we have traditionally we would have worked very much with disability sector organisations, and still do. There still would be a connection with that. So that's why I would say that this is a brand new step for us. A DPO is a representative voice of disabled people. And I would say to you, community development workers, that you cannot presume that you know the issues of disabled people. I live with a disabled person, but I would say that I would have really no understanding of the lived experience because I'm not disabled. So that's obvious. So I think we need to say that and recognise that. And I think as a community worker, you should definitely undertake disability equality training. And that should be an ongoing thing, because we and I have grown up with the medical model as predominant and with the charity model as predominant, which is predominant in ours. We're all influenced by that in our heads. So we need to do disability equality training, as do disabled people themselves, to be able to work and advocate for disabled people. I think we need to promote disabled people and work with within our own organisation. That's a very important thing. And we need to ensure that DPOs are mentioned in our PSYCAP plans, that they are written in, and that the language is used. So the term disabled person should be used within the plans, if possible. We should proof the work within PSYCAP, within our organisations as development workers, because a lot of the other workers would maybe not have undertaken disability equality training, may not, and would still use the term people with disabilities. And we should work work with the likes of Independent Living Movement Ireland, which is an organisation that promotes and is a DPO in itself. And we should work directly with disabled people. And this is a long and slow process. It's very easy to work with disability sector organisations. It's safe, it's handy, you can tick it off your box and say, I did that, but that doesn't work. It doesn't actually, it's not effective. So I think, trying to see what else I have here. The other thing is that in terms of the DPOs at local level, they're perfectly placed because they can link into the public participation network, which is a structure within the councils, which allow participation of the public within structures that influence, say, housing development, environment. And in fact, I know that ILMI is represented on the housing strategy in Leitrim. And also, I think we should, that the DPOs can allow disabled people to go on to like the HSE strategy committees, education. It's a brilliant mechanism, and it's the only real effective mechanism. And I think that's where our focus should be with when we're working with disabled people. Obviously, we need to also look at education, employment, etc. But under the PSYCAP programme, under Goal 1, I think our primary purpose should be to work to establish DPOs locally with other organisations like ILMI, to seek dedicated resources and to lobby for dedicated resources for DPOs, which they definitely need. And we should also then link DPOs to within our own networking structures, so they can be effective mechanisms to make disabled people visible locally and to allow them to talk about their lived experience and what the barriers that they understand are. Okay, so I think I don't want to keep you too much longer because I'm aware that you've listened to a lot. But I think I just want to say thanks to ILMI and to Community Workers Ireland. I think it's a really important event, and I think it's very good inputs, and I hope that people have learned something from it. And thanks very much.
Thanks, Teresa. That was really, really helpful and really practical advice, and speaking directly to community workers who are a key target audience of this, to be thinking about their practices, to think about how they can engage with ILMI, how they can engage with disabled people locally to get that voice and lived experience, as I say, onto the key structures like the public participation networks, like the housing disability steering groups. What I want to do just before we go to the Q&A, I'd like to thank both Orla and Elizabeth for providing ISL throughout this webinar. I'd like to thank Teresa, Rachel, Paula, Martin and Peter for their excellent inputs. I'd like to echo Rachel's sentiment at the start of her input. This is not the end point. This is just the start of a conversation around how we can create autonomous spaces, collective spaces on a cross-impairment basis for disabled people to influence change, to build a more inclusive society locally and nationally. How we can learn from how community development approaches have had an appreciable impact in allowing travellers to self-organise, to have their voices heard, to challenge racism, to challenge oppression, for people to be empowered to have their voices heard, and how we can build on that experience to build that into the work of ILMI and local DPOs. And we will make this recording available to anyone who's registered. And what I'll do now is I'll open up, if anyone has any particular questions, to put those into the chat function. We've brought that back in there. And I'm going to go the first question. And Peter, I might throw this to you because I know there's an area of expertise. It's from Mairead Klusky, is asking, where can people access the disability equality training? And I'll come to you, Peter, and then we'll take a question after that.
Thanks, Damien. And again, thanks to Paula, Martin, and Peter. Great input. And and speaking directly to community development workers. In terms of disability equality training, we do disability equality training ourselves, and it's a good question because for a long time there's been something called disability awareness training. We definitely don't do that, and that's placing people in wheelchairs, wearing blindfolds, walking around with crutches. That supposedly gives an experience of what it is to be a person with an impairment label. We don't deal with impairment labels. We deal with disabling barriers that can be changed and can be cured. You think of myself in the 1960s, I had to go to a special school because I had the label of CP, or at that time it was spastic, although that's still a clinical name. But it's changed now. There's a lot more kids now with CP being born, which is interesting. But most of them, if not all of them, go to local normal school. So that's changed. But several policy hasn't changed. It's still the same. It's still the same as it ever was. Going back to the caveman and woman. So my theory is that today people see people because we shake so much that got us through winter. We were warm through winter. But in terms of disability equality training, it has to be delivered by disabled people who have the background in medical and social models and intersectionality and community development principles is very important. So I do it in terms of introduction to disability equality training, in terms of community development workers, where can you get disability equality studies and training. ILMI is a working partnership with the Atlantic Technological University. We're setting up a Centre for Disability Equality Studies. But they already have a postgrad cert diploma and master's in disability equality training. So if anybody wants to contact me, Peter Kearns at ILMI.ie, I lecture on that as well. So there is we're quite proud of that, but we're thinking not only on the Ireland, but also Ireland and Britain. It's quite unique postgrad dedicated disability equality studies. So and again, in this gig we're talking to community development workers. So I might seem a bit strong here, but I think it's your responsibility, like Rachel said, and like Teresa said, is to go and get that disability equality training. It's not just enough to apply, think you can apply community development principles. You really need that disability equality training to see if you've got competence to work with disabled people or different class, different background, different gender as well. So you don't get caught up on the impairment label and go down an impairment label rabbit hole. So as I said, disability equality training is training much not about impairment, because impairment I change all the time. So I don't identify as self-quality. I identify as a disabled person, disabled by society, because I have no power over the impairment. So there's no point in talking about the impairment, but there's every point in talking about the barriers really change. So I hope, Damien, that's a quick rant there. I don't know, might help.
Appreciate that. Thanks very much, Peter. So there are, as Peter says, there are professional qualifications through St Angela's around disability equality. Peter and a number of the staff from ILMI do provide disability equality training for organisations, and particularly for community development organisations. I think it's really important to differentiate that from a box ticking exercise that doesn't really explore the systemic oppression and goes for disability awareness. But as Teresa says, embeds very strong values and principles into an exploration from the lived experience of disabled people through a disability equality lens. So many thanks for that, Mairead. There was a question from Ciara directly to Martin. I'm sorry, hold on, sorry, just the ones after popping up. From Anne, how do you handle a scenario where we adopt the social model language, but other disabled people object to that language when we feel we're dismissing their autonomy to determine the language used? Peter, I don't want to be putting you under pressure, but that seems to be right up your alley there. But Paula, you feel free to jump in if you want to as well.
A good question, and it's very interesting. Even during this fantastic seminar, I was getting such correspondence on a lawyer chat. Yeah, it's and great. It's great. I forgot to mention it, and Teresa mentioned it. Fantastic that disability equality training. My main audience for disability equality training is disabled people. So and we do have there is an issue in the DPOs that just because a disabled person joins the DPO, that they're not born with knowledge of the medical and social or intersectionality. That has to be developed through education, and as Rachel said, community development, capacity building of people. And man gives that great story about moving out of the church-centered so-called itinerant centers to a community development space where travelers would look at that oppression as something that could change. So it's the same with disabled people to get that space where they can explore that discourse around their lived experience, and also the lived experience, a medical model lived experience, and a social model lived experience as well. So yes, the DPOs enacted a benign passive platform for the daily people to gather around. They have to be collective, organising and education of the daily people to explore disability equality. So ILMI and like Leitrim, the grammar from the Donegal, Loud, Cavan, we are developing that kind of induction around disabled people, because disabled people have to let go of that history that they brought into in the medical model, and that's a lot. That's a lot to let go. You know, that's a lot to let go. So it is a challenge for community. That's why community development workers, they really have to get that disability equality confidence behind you, and that's why that it won't work in the disability sector. It can only work in the community sector. So hopefully that will help.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I'm sure that Martin, if you wanted to come in, there probably were similar processes around creating those collective spaces for people to analyze language and oppression that travellers have gone through in the past as well. Paul, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add in terms of language and how disabled people view themselves.
Yeah, just before Martin comes in there, I suppose for me personally, going back to what Peter said, the importance of, the identifying as that there's a medical model identification aspect and also a social model identification. So obviously before I got involved with ILMI, I would have identified as a person with a disability, and I would have thought that my seat, the impairment label I have, cerebral palsy, was my disability. But then when I got involved with the DPO and learned about the social model, I actually rejected that idea, which was difficult at times, and it can be overwhelming. But that's why it's so important to be involved in a space like a DPO, to be involved with collective community work, so that you're involved with like-minded people to actually adopt a social model and realise why it's so important. Because to me personally, it was the difference between realising my full potential or not. Before I got involved with ILMI and knew about the social model, I had a completely different way of perspective and a different way of thinking, and it's opened up so many doors for me. And I want that for other disabled people, for them to know that, you do have a lot more potential than what society would actually have to realise. And the medical model benefits non-disabled professionals mostly, and it benefits them when disabled people are quiet and submissive, and they just go along with the status quo. So it can be difficult, but I am very passionate about language and the social model, and that has changed my life, and I want that for other disabled people as well.
I think, Paula, that's a fitting way to end this first conversation. I want to thank you. I want to thank Peter. I want to thank Teresa and Rachel and Martin for your excellent inputs. To begin that conversation, it's at that point, as I just again thank Elizabeth and Orla for providing sign language interpretation, to thank everyone for their participation in this webinar, In From the Margins. It is a beginning point of a conversation around creating collective autonomous spaces and community development approaches with disabled people. We will be in touch, and we'll hope to have future events to explore this, but we really hope this is a webinar that people have learned a lot from, that is provoking some thought among people, and we hope to reach out to build on this over the course of 2022 and ahead. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation.